Hi everybody, my name is Andrea Lorenz. This is my presentation on vulnerable populations. So we will go over 8 different vulnerable populations, and they are listed on the Lucid chart in the circle, all in different colors. We will also go over connections to risk factors for these vulnerable populations, as well as a little bit of how they interact with one another. So we'll start by talking about vulnerable populations, basically groups of people who are exposed or have a lifestyle of or have come in contact with some type of situation that can increase their risk for healthcare issues. So for vulnerable populations, I'm going to start at the top in the green box for homelessness. So we see first to the left, the green arrow, that homeless are exposed or have higher risk for self-care deficit. So when you don't have shelter, which is one of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we really can't take care of anything else above that. So the little things that somebody may worry about who is not homeless, homeless might not have time to worry about these certain things. Stuff like hygiene and adequate clothing, stuff that's warm and safe and that kind of stuff. When really we're just homeless are just mostly trying to find some type of shelter, food, and water. To the right, we have decreased access to healthcare. Oh, I'm sorry. Out of the bottom to the right, we have exposure. So again, talking about homelessness is lack of a permanent setting, but also times it's a lack of shelter in general. So exposure to elements, exposure to diseases. And I didn't draw it in because it was hard to connect it, but there should be part of the exposure should connect down to infectious disease, which is one of our other vulnerable populations, because just there are contractable diseases that people who don't have shelter are more exposed to. Here in San Diego, where I'm from, we recently had a Hep A outbreak that was largely driven by homeless populations. And as we know, that's fecal oral exposure. That was really devastating to the homeless population here. So the two top green arrows, we have decreased access to healthcare and decreased nutrition. And naturally, we make the assumption that the homeless population might not always have a meal, might not always have the next meal, might not always have a nutritious meal at that, and may not have hydration as well. And lastly, again, decreased access to healthcare. Of course, this population of people might not have the time, the money, and or even know that they need healthcare for any certain thing. So moving to the right, we'll cover poverty. And important thing to first note is that that poverty to the left, again, goes to self-care deficit. You actually see a trend that all of them go to the self-care deficit, but not having enough money to afford basic life-sustaining stuff can really affect how someone takes care of themselves and what they're able to provide for themselves. And a lot of times healthcare gets pushed to the back burner, especially because it's incredibly expensive. And we have to assume also that people who are very impoverished might not have health insurance. Decreased nutrition. Again, that is another one that poverty shares with homelessness. Sometimes when people are impoverished, they may not have enough to eat. And again, they may not have the right types of foods, not nutritious enough foods to eat. I think that it's important too. Again, I was not allowed as many lines as I would have liked, and it became very hard to look at. But poverty should also be connected to homelessness, because a lot of times poverty can be the catalyst to why people end up on the streets and homeless. I also drew a line from poverty to rural health. Sometimes we know how expensive the cities can be. And for myself in San Diego, the more you get towards the center of San Diego, the more expensive the housing becomes, with the exceptions of certain neighborhoods that you know just based off of our different projects and stuff, are more impoverished than others. But for the most part, the closer to the city you get, the more expensive it is. So the poverty-ridden populations can be pushed into more rural settings at sometimes. And then, of course, decreased access to healthcare. And again, we touched on the fact that healthcare is very expensive. And when you're worrying about everything else, like how to feed yourself, how to get enough hydration, how to have a place to sleep, how to keep your roof over your head, sometimes these things like healthcare get put on the back burner. And next, we're moving on to the yellow box, which is mental illness. So first and foremost, I think mental illness can be debilitating, which is that first yellow line coming out on the right. Sometimes people's certain illnesses and severity and exacerbations in times of crisis can be so debilitating that they cannot focus on any other type of healthcare, or they're not even able to get treatment for the mental illness itself. Mental illness can be incredibly profound in its debilitation. I actually work in mental illness now, so something I'm very familiar with. Many times mental illness can lead to self-medicating, which is that second yellow arrow underneath. And that can have a direct correlation to drugs, alcohol, and other types of vices, for lack of a better term, that can be used to self-medicate mental illness. And of course, lastly, like I said, that leads back to the self-care deficit. Underneath mental illness, our blue box is migrant health. So we'll start to the right again. Migrant health goes back up to decreased access to healthcare. Migrant workers usually are seasonal, based off of farming and crops for the most part, and they go where the jobs are, which can be rural, which can be no town at all, can be tents and that type of thing, and they follow the work. It means that they might not always have access to good healthcare or enough healthcare, and it might not even be available to them to take time off of work for that type of thing. Again, exposure. So with migrant health, a big thing is exposure to chemicals and the elements. So when we get a mental image of migrant health in our mind, we imagine a person who's out in fields working very hard all day long, lots of sun, lots of exposure, but also lots of chemicals, and that type of stuff can lead to disease and cancers and all sorts of things. So we'll move along to the bottom, and migrant health, of course, connects to self-care deficit. Migrant workers are seasonal and follow the work, and when you're trying to make sure that you can show up for the next job, it doesn't always mean that you have time to care for yourself. So, and lastly, we have a cultural predisposition to healthcare. So we know that many migrant workers come from different cultures than our own, and may have different views and values on what they believe is worth seeking health treatment, or what they have time for, or maybe their work ethic is higher than their health value, and all of that can play a role in how fast, how soon, and how much they seek healthcare. We'll move on to infectious diseases, the purple box, again starting to the right. So debilitating. Infectious diseases, depending on what kind and whether or not they're chronic or lifelong or terminal. Infectious diseases can completely take over somebody's life in having to seek treatment and having to make appointments and to having to come up with the means and funds and transportation to help you care for the infectious disease at which you're fighting. Our second purple line, again, will go to self-care deficit. Sometimes your other diseases get put on the back burner. You may be fighting one disease and not even see the signs and symptoms that it's leading to another thing, or that you have another thing. And it can all become very overwhelming for patients with infectious diseases, especially if they're going to be dealing with it on a chronic, I shouldn't say, if it's chronic and terminal, that can be absolutely overwhelming. Maybe they don't even want to focus on it at all, which can lead to a deficit. And then the last purple line will be under treatment can be very expensive. So under some infectious diseases and chronic diseases, treatment can be out of control. and unaffordable, unattainable. So we'll move over to the left pink box. We have addiction. Addiction is immediately connected to self-medicating. Can be a huge reason that people struggle from addiction is maybe mental illness led them to drugs and alcohol, which led them to addiction. Because you can have a physiological addiction and a mental addiction, and they can come together. They can come at different times. It's a very slippery slope with substance abuse. Our second one is debilitating. Somebody who is in the throes of a physiological and a mental addiction to a substance, at some points and at some severities, can do absolutely nothing else than seek out their substance under whatever means necessary, and it can completely compromise their health at that point. Not to mention substances in general are not great for your health, just on a regular basis, much less when you have a physiological or mental addiction to a substance. Addiction treatment can be expensive. The privatized treatment facilities, detoxes, and places are very, very expensive. Sober livings that happen after you've detoxed, incredibly expensive. And the county programs are always impacted. They always, for the most part, have a wait list. I've seen very few times where, the county detox is readily available, and the rate of people seeking treatment is far greater than the services that we're able to provide at this point. And again, like all others, goes to self-care deficit. As a very unfortunate part of addiction, sometimes all you can be focused on is satisfying your high at that point. And it really can lead to not having room for the other parts of your life, like self-care. We'll move on above addiction to our blue box, which is violence. So for violence, the first line can lead to cultural predispositions to healthcare. And I don't mean this cultural maybe in like the ethnicity or race particularly. I mean in that become accustomed to violence, whether it be domestic or against you or domestic in your household, what you witness, it can create a culture within itself to where you feel maybe you don't deserve help, or that a person cannot get out or unable to. So I definitely mean culture in the terms of violence, not in the terms of race or ethnicity. But it can lead a lot to seeking healthcare when you're fearing for your life, for your safety, for the safety of your family and or children, or whatever may be, can deter many people from seeking help. And again, ties into self-care deficit. Sometimes people who are victims of violence are just trying to stay alive. They'll do whatever they can to stay alive, and it really doesn't leave a lot of room for self-care. Rural health, the orange box above violence. Again, predispositions to healthcare down to the bottom, cultural predispositions. And again, cultural in the term of people who either choose or do choose to live in rural health. A lot of times there are different cultures of people out there, and there's different ways that people do things out in the sticks, as we call it. I lived in a very small town with only 100 people for a time being, and things can be handled very differently out there. You don't always have access to healthcare, which is actually kind of ties into the other orange line, the last one, is that sometimes you're so far away from healthcare that people in rural communities kind of find ways to handle things amongst themselves, which can be a great thing, but it can also be a dangerous thing when you're needing medical care in a more traditional setting. And again, the last one over there, self-care deficit. Rural health can place you in a position where healthcare does not become a priority for you because it's just highly unattainable, be it distance or predispositions or many different factors associated with rural health. You'll also notice over in the top right corner of my Lucid chart that I put all vulnerable populations lead to decreased healthcare literacy. Um, Basically, what that means is the eight vulnerable populations, all of these different things that the people in these categories experience can lead to decreased healthcare literacy. For example, poverty, we talked about it many times. Being impoverished, you have to worry about how you're going to feed yourself, shelter yourself. Maybe you don't have time to read up on the things that you should know and about how to receive healthcare. Maybe you weren't able to afford these instructions, that type of thing. And each one of these 8 subjects really can lead to decreased healthcare literacy. I don't feel that one population doesn't. So it's very important that we remember that these things need to be addressed, and that educating in a patient, calm, effective manner is how all of our vulnerable populations, as well as our regular patients, need to be treated. I'm quickly going to exit out of this and show my references page. I mostly used our instructors' PowerPoint presentations, the chapter snapshots for my references, as well as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There are my references. Thank you so much, guys. It's been a pleasure, and good luck, everybody, with the rest of the class.